in terms of 3 I's, about helping the sector in terms of innovation, trying to influence the sector and influence on people on behalf of the sector, and helping the sector to improve. And that's the way that we think we can improve the impact of the sector, and therefore it can help more people, which is the whole point of why NPC exists. Over the years, we've lots of highlights. We've had the drive to make the sector more impactful has led us to using a lot of bringing theory of change into the UK and using it a lot. We've done work on trying to assess how much charities are actually using that and encourage them more. We've over the years changed, as organisations often do, as to exactly what we do. We did not start off working directly with charities, but we do a lot of that, and that began over a decade ago. Philanthropy has been at our core right from the beginning, and we've been able to work with some wonderful philanthropists, including the Stone Family Foundation as an example, as they've developed over the years. Because we want to get to the whole sector, we've become more of a think tank, having a policy arm and communications very important if we want to achieve our mission. We've done work in recent years, for instance, on identifying that where are England's charities and finding out that they are less prevalent in more deprived areas. We've done a lot of work in the last year or so on levelling up, trying to push the government to make sure that the role of the civil society and social sector is understood. We've incubated various organisations, the Social Impact Analysts Association, which is now part of Social Value UK and Social Value International, and research leading to others like National Numeracy and Safe Lives. We pushed on data. The Justice Data Lab that exists, run by the MOJ, was our baby, and data dashboards that we're putting out, including during COVID. As we work with so many wonderful organisations in the sector, and it's been a pleasure to do so. We work, as I say, as a consultancy and as a think tank. And the consultancy, obviously people pay for it, so we hope that means they value it. And the rest of our work, we have to raise the funding in the normal way of a charity. So we feel very strong affinity with the sector because we have to do exactly what they have to do and go out and raise that money in restricted and unrestricted money. So that's a very brief intro. We've got a terrific panel. I hope you're going to enjoy this session. In a minute, I'm going to pass over to Danielle Walker Palmour, who is many things, founding director of Friends Provident Foundation, which is a terrific foundation, and of course, a former NPC trustee, and I'm sure we'll hear a few thoughts from her on her time doing that. She does many other things, and I'm sure she'll tell you about them a bit later. We now have Albert Tucker. Albert joined the board of NPC last year. He has done many things. And he's at the moment governance and business advisor for Ford, an African diaspora organisation advising business in Africa and the UK, and he's a trustee at Carnegie, amongst other things. And then Fran Perrin, one of the sort of great and pushing out there UK philanthropists. She joined our board in 2019. People will know that she got 360 Giving going. She runs her own foundation, which does some great work as well. So we're going to get different perspectives from these people about what NPC's done, what it's doing, and what it needs to do. And I hope you're going to enjoy it. I'm going to pass over to Danielle.
Thanks so much, Dan. And it's really an absolute pleasure to join NPC on 20th anniversary. It's absolutely incredible. It's been that long, which shows me that I am getting old in the tooth, which is fine. You know, you have to embrace these things. I own it. Thanks very much for asking me to take part in this panel discussion with Albert and Fran, who I've known both for quite a long time, but not through NPC. So it's great to see how we all meet in this place. I was just reflecting when I was thinking about joining this event on my relationship with NPC and how it's changed over the years. But I was thinking back to the very beginnings, because I joined as a trustee in 2005. So NPC had just been running for a few years, but not very many. And it was a bit of a curiosity. And I think my first impression was built on a truth and a fallacy. I think the truth is one I think is still the truth, which is that money was not following impact in our sector, that there was a need to look at why we were funding as funders things that were not effective, not necessarily effective at all. We had very little data understanding, in-depth, independent, looking at impact, other things we were putting money into. And we did assessments. It's not to say we as philanthropists were in any way remiss. It's just that the framework wasn't there to understand how best to make impact on the social issues we care about. So I think that was the truth that NPC certainly at that early stage had put its stall out to say, we are about tracking that impact and understanding it and getting evidence to support it. So that was the truth bit. I think there was a fallacy also underpinning my first impression of NPC. I'm pretty sure it was a fallacy, and that was that the city frameworks and disciplines were going to sort that out. And there was this perception of NPC in those early days that it was a bunch of city guys who just sort of said, right, if we just put some money into this, we can actually sort out this fundamental issue around impact and really sort out for philanthropists how best to invest to make a difference. I do think it's a fallacy because I don't actually believe that kind of arrogance was at the very, very heart of NPC, but it's certainly a very strong impression in the sector. And it led to a lot of suspicion. And I mean, that had to do with who was recruited into NPC and the people who were funding it at the time. And I think it also played into a wider conversation that was happening around philanthrocapitalism, and that a lot of .com millionaires in the States were coming into philanthropy to sort out all these big problems. And so I think out of my own personal position is that I was incredibly curious about this stuff. And so that's why, in some ways, when I was asked by Peter Wheeler to become a trustee, and the rest of the board thought it wouldn't be too awful, I joined so that I could actually understand and get under the hood of that. And I think I did understand that it wasn't the case. However, NPC's emphasis and focus on evidence, data, analysis, and transparency was absolutely at the heart of what NPC did, and I believe it still is. So that was my kind of opening line in terms of my first impressions of NPC. But yes, focusing on the beginnings, I'll start with you, Dan, because I think your appointment perhaps was out of that away from perhaps that idea, the fallacy of NPC as a creature of the city. What was your first impression, Dan, before you joined?
Thanks a lot, Danielle. I mean, it was interesting. I knew a bit about NPC. I'd heard about it and vaguely knew what they did. It was interesting because you're right, there was a city emphasis. I often say that, we've done a lot to try and diversify our board in particular, but one of the first things was trying to make sure it wasn't all people from the city. And that had started to happen, and it's happened an awful lot more since. I mean, I think that sort of optimism that was around in the early, part of the century, that any problem could be solved, was slightly what got NPC going. And the founders were brave, maybe a bit too optimistic. And it's interesting. So I come in, I'm much more interested. Obviously, the board appointed me that. I've been involved in public policy. I'm strong on comms and influencing and all the rest of it. I actually had come directly from private sector consulting, which was going to be very helpful. But interestingly as well, I'm an economist by profession, and I slightly thought that NPC might be stuff full of economists, and it certainly isn't. We do have people that know their economics, but both, as you said, Danielle, the idea that we can produce and apply analysis and data and all that kind of thing to make philanthropy better, to help charities put their resources in the places that would really make a difference, is absolutely crucial. But I'm a skeptic about how far you can go to sort of work out a metric which will judge between charities doing completely different things, or tell a charity that, for instance, I don't know, is working on mental health, how much money it should spend on service delivery as opposed to research, as opposed to advocacy. The idea there's some social return on investment calculation you can do, which will tell you the difference, isn't there. And I've tried in very many ways. I felt that what we're trying to do is to change the culture within philanthropy and within the charity sector, so that people are trying to ask that question: how am I using my resources, and could I use them better? Answering that is very difficult in our sector. It's not like private sector when you've got 50 products and you just see in real time what profitability is going on, and if some aren't very profitable, you kind of stop doing them. It's much more difficult in our sector, but that should be the mindset. I knew NPC would have good people. It's always had good people. I'm astonished at what fantastic people we managed to recruit, people who care, people, quite frankly, who could be earning more elsewhere, but really care, work hard, and want to make our sector better so that it helps more people. And I think that's something we tried to do, Danielle, in the last few years. We got slightly obsessed about we're trying to make philanthropists better and charities better, but we kind of lost sight of why are we doing all this? Well, we're doing all this because we hope that by doing that, more people can have good lives, and that's what it's all about.
I mean, I suppose the other thing about the relationship with the city is obviously the staff side, which is obviously what we were just talking about, but also the funding model was a different model, where we actually did, when I was on the board, quite a lot of the board members were also funders, and that was not me. I was just really conscious of that being quite, for me, it was quite unusual. It's not unusual in a foundation, but it's quite unusual in a charity. So yeah, I think that's also shifted over time, hasn't it?
It has, Danielle. It's shifted a lot, and it's shifting more. We raise quite a lot of our income now from our consultancy work, both with charities and philanthropists. We do work for government and others, which makes us a bit of a surplus. And then we have to raise our money. And I mean, this year, our trustees who help us in so many ways with their experience, energy, perspectives, we've got a very fine bunch at the moment. And a number of them have got together, and because we're launching our 20th anniversary Future Fund appeal, they've got together to say that they will match fund donations up to a total of £200,000. So that's our kind of appeal. I'm getting the plug in for it there. And in a way, I mean, picking up what you were saying, Danielle, that kind of marks the end of a transition from our original sort of founder funded model to us generating our income through fundraising and earned income. And that's how we're going to be. That's why this appeal is important, because everybody knows if you want to do some of the stuff that really matters, you've got to have unrestricted funding. So it's quite a change. I think, sometimes I look enviously, quite frankly, Danielle, at foundations. The only job you've got is how to give the money out. We've got to sort of work out where it is. On the other hand, we have to be, if you like, very close to the sector. We have to be very close. People wouldn't hire us in consultancy if we didn't know our staff. But it allows us to get right inside all sorts of charities, foundations, understand the problems that they have, the issues that they're coping with, and we take that into our other work. And then we have to convince funders that the work we want to do really will help the sector have a wider perspective. And it certainly makes us very, very sharp. There's no room for laziness and sort of loose thinking at NPC. So there's moments when I wish the funding model was a bit different, but on the whole, I think it makes us more relevant rather than less.
No, I think that sharpness is good. It does give a good edge and gives us some discipline as funders. Actually, I'll turn to Fran as a fellow philanthropist, but obviously you do so many other things, and I have to say, just a plug, as I always do at any opportunity, 360 Giving is such an important bit of infrastructure now in our sector, and you drove that through, and it is a real tribute. But so all the things you get up to and do, why did you get involved with NPC?
I had to look back and check, because I felt a bit like Dan. I'd been involved for a long time, although not with as much devotion and energy as Dan has. I was first involved with NPC as a funder of work back in 2009, which seems a very long time ago. I'd recently become a full-time philanthropist, having previously done it sort of in my spare time while working in the Cabinet Office. And I was at the stage of wanting to know how to be a better philanthropist, wanting to know how to make more impact and to support charities better. But I was puzzled and worried because all other philanthropists seemed to know exactly how to do this and to have all the answers. And I thought I was the only one who was worried and anxious that I didn't know exactly what to do and who to fund or what would have the most impact. So I was delighted to find NPC, not because they frame themselves as having all the answers, but they were asking the right questions and taking an approach which made sense to me. You know, let's find out the information, let's map the sector, look at who is doing what in this area, what's the systems change approach. So I was really excited about that and the ability to support charities, but also to get philanthropists to step up their game. And because it's the kind of thing that fascinates me, to look at the infrastructure, what works, what doesn't work for charities. And so our early involvement was around homelessness issues, Ministry of Justice Data Lab, and looking at where the gaps are in information. It was 10 years later that I became a trustee and was absolutely delighted to join and sort of to see myself as a team member, because the projects that NPC is working on are just incredibly exciting to me. I didn't know then that we'd be going into 2 years of pandemic, but I saw that as a real call for philanthropy to step up its game. You know, if philanthropy can't help during times like these, then what on earth is the point? And also to see how quickly NPC responded in getting great advice out to charities and donors. So it's been a tumultuous couple of years.
Yeah. And I mean, given that and the emphasis and things that you cared about, I mean, what would you say to someone sort of new to NPC compared, you know, just from when you started to now and the way it's changed? What would you say are the kind of two key things that would help someone new to NPC to understand it, to get under the skin?
I think a lot of the ideas that NPC have been talking about for 20 years have become much more standard in the sector. Things that NPC might have said 20 years ago would have met with bafflement or confusion or disagreement. And actually they're things that many of us have taken on board. They're not controversial. They're part of our everyday language and mindset. And I think some of that is just looking at what will help charities deliver the most. So I always come back to the building blocks, the really dull infrastructure that helps everybody do their job. I think what I'd want people to know about NPC is the passion that drives the work. It might seem from a step away that this is quite academic or theoretical or management consultancy, and actually it's driven by a real love of the sector, but an impatience to help charities more, and to maximise every philanthropic pound. The complexity of the problems are so great. All the philanthropic funding in the UK isn't going to solve these problems. So at least we need to make sure that it's getting the most out of every pound.
Absolutely. And bringing Albert in, as a very new trustee, you must have joined during the pandemonium, the pandemic. What's excited you about getting involved, given the fact, I don't know, have you actually met as a board yet?
Yes.
Oh,
yes,
well
we
done.
have. Yes, we have. And as Dan was saying, there's some amazing people on the board. For me, I actually listening to you all talking, I remember first hearing about the founding of the NPC and thinking, and like many, thought, good luck with that. It'll be a bunch of philanthropists who are going to be telling you what to do and coming back and giving pronouncements to us about what they want to fund, or it'll be a little body that has access to all this philanthropist funding and keeps it to themselves. And didn't engage with it again for a little while. And actually, I was quite pleased. The next time I remember is connecting with NPC when it started more working with the charities themselves. Because in my working life, one of my frustrations is those who control money often have no idea what the realities of doing what they're trying to change is. And so therefore they make rules and constraints, which actually makes people spend a lot of time reporting on those rules and constraints than delivering the benefits. And so it kind of, I thought, well, good, at least they're working with charities now, but you know, again, equally then thinking, well, they might be quite an academic organization and so on, and policy-based. And my trouble back then with policy-based and academic work was that the people I saw in that sphere, when I've tried to enter it, have not really reflected me or the people I worked with. There's been a very particular class type education and class type of person who I generally saw in that field. So I felt, well, good, but okay. And then more recently, I've seen the results of the work of NPC kind of slowly creeping into the work I'm doing, particularly in the international development sphere, in the grant making sphere, and thinking, well, actually, and that challenge I saw about this impact question, I've had the greatest trouble with funders, governmental organizations, private sector companies who want to do philanthropy, ethical trading organizations on how they impact on communities, asking for the most ridiculous things to actually justify giving the money, which actually means a lot of the money is not going to what they want it to. So seeing actually structures being built that are actually being practically implemented, I thought was interesting. Although, you know, some of them, when I first came across theory of change, I thought, well, yeah, a bit academic, a bit this, a bit that. But as people have used it in different ways, and I've come across having to use it in different ways, I thought, well, actually, it's a platform for doing things. So the opportunity to join and get involved in that thought, it would help me with my problem with impact measures and measurement to actually learn more from what NPC is doing. But also I thought I could bring some of my practical experience into that. And in modern times now, in the times we live in, a lot of the people who should be using this thinking and this intelligence and influencing don't really generally have as much access as I think they should have. And in all my work in the sector, the thing I found we didn't have so much access to was the policy influencing and advocacy side. So one of the things I'm really excited about joining NPC for is this thinking of how does it put its work into people's hands, as well as influencing the philanthropists and the funders and the policymakers. But how does that get into people's hands who don't normally get access to that information or that intelligence? And so that's what I'm really interested in. And you know, they're a pretty bright bunch, both as staff and board. I know that's always interesting to work with. And there's the other elements of the business, the consultancy and so on, and the engaging with charities actually pulls out some of the challenges in a thoughtful way, which is some of us look at these things in a very brash and responsive way, but actually looking at those things in a thoughtful way and in a challenging way is something positive. And I think we do need that, and particularly in this times when things are so fractured.
I think that's right. I think that's really interesting. I was just it sparked so many questions and points in my mind, which I won't spring on Dan straight away. But there is something really interesting about the language, and you've sort of got the creeping of sort of NPC ethos in the sector. But I do think it's always a question in my mind as someone who's really feeling as a philanthropist, impact is important and understanding it. But I always wonder, is there a distorting effect on what we do in our desire to be thinking about impact, like how when we will tell the story, does it change what we do because we're focusing kind of on that story, perhaps without the intervention? Anyway, it's a general question, but I mean, just moving on to how NPC has worked and how it does work and how it started, which was very much focused on philanthropy and fixing, I think the term used to be changing the plumbing, so that money actually did kind of follow the logic of impact. But has it shifted, Dan? If we're thinking about how it's changed, how it's worked with philanthropists and charities, has that shifted specifically?
I think it has, Danielle, and obviously I wasn't there in the first decade, so things I say about that may be through talking to people who were around then. But to some extent, I think the original model kind of saw philanthropists that we would sort of give them a service, as it were, to help them, and obviously we still do that. But I think there's a much stronger feeling that that philanthropists at their best are sort of agents of change, and that they are very important in shaping the whole sector. And I think one of the things, we then started working with charities, and in my time we've worked far more directly with charities as well as philanthropists. And we've also discovered that one of the things we can do, which is very powerful, is bringing those two sides together. That it's very difficult in normal times. There is a power dynamic, and we do quite a lot of work on those power dynamics about people who want the money and are receiving it and those that give. And there is often not an honest conversation, quite frankly, between them. And there's misunderstanding, I think, which has been spoken about already. And providing a kind of forum where people can hear each other and what their worries are and what the problems are in a sort of neutral way has been is probably something we don't even still understand how important that is in our sector. I mean, one of the problems for charities who are receiving money is they do spend far too long looking up at who are the money givers and how do they get the money off them. And that distorts what they do. It distorts the feedback they give back. It distorts their incentives to collaborate with other people because they feel they're competing with them. It even distorts what they say about impact. If some funder says they want a good impact or something, then they'll get some, not NPC, but somebody who will claim that they've got a great impact, and the numbers start getting meaningless because they're just sort of producing the number that they need to get the money. So I think that's something that has changed a lot, and being very clear that bringing people together and convening is something that we can do. And I think that it sort of adds, in a sense, to every organisation is always trying to talk about its uniqueness, and we can all overdo this kind of stuff. But we very much pride ourselves on our independence. We are not there's lots of membership organisations in the sector of all types, for charities, for foundations, and they all do a good job. Membership organisations are needed, but to some extent it constrains what you can say as leaders of those organisations, and we don't have that. We say what we think, what we find. We sometimes annoy people, quite frankly, who say, you're always urging us to do this, that, and the other, and you don't understand it, and so forth. So yeah, I think it's changed a lot. And as I say, if the model at the beginning was that if it wasn't quite what the founders thought, but if you could change funder behaviour, philanthropists' behaviour, then to some extent you would drive out the poor charities, if you like, and the good charities would expand. And that's not a bad thought about how things work. But I think we worked out, that you have to work with the charities directly themselves, not just through the funding routes, to help them think about these issues. But then you do have to bring the two groups together. And as I say, that doesn't happen that often. And when it does happen, it's riddled with these power dynamics, which means nobody quite says the same. So yeah, I think we've changed a lot. I hope it's been the right thing to do. I think it has been.
I mean, one of the things I was reflecting back in the day, and it was a relatively early stage of impact investing. And I remember I was thinking one place where we do share and a connection with not-for-profits and funders is actually when we do impact investing, because there is an element, in my view, in the best kind of impact investing where we are risk sharing. We are sharing, that in some ways, ideally, we're taking on board some of the financial risk to achieve the impact working with the charity. In some ways, that is a much more, my personal view from an impact investment perspective has been that that's a much more, it's a more equal relationship, or it can be. When you're big in impact investing. And I didn't know, Albert, because you've got involvement in impact investing, is this a direction of travel for philanthropy? Is this something that you have been involved in?
Maybe a direction of travel for philanthropy, but it's not, the concept is not new, but I struggle with the concept. In my work across different cultures, I've learned that English is one of those languages, which depending on where you are in time and place, can mean so many different things. I learned English as a second language, and I was always in trouble in school asking why words are the way they are. And impact investment is one of those. Impact investment is talked about in lots of different ways, and sometimes we cross them too much. So for example, there are things which will never be able to get to sustain themselves financially. They're going to need to be supported philanthropically, grant-wise, community engage-wise, volunteering-wise. Let's not try and squeeze them into some kind of loan investment model. I like talking about blended finance. Problems are solved in lots of different ways. In my work with Karma Foundation, for example, I chair the foundation there and the trust, and working with the communities in Sierra Leone. People want girls to go to school for those who can't afford it. So we create a bursary, and how we make that sustainable is we get them managing it. Well, we know that will always be top. You cannot sustainable finance girls to go to school, which we're from by people who cannot afford it, basically. So that's, it's part of our impact, yes, but it's a grant. But on the other hand, we've supported entrepreneurs in those communities who during Ebola found people couldn't get resources, so they went out with funding 70 entrepreneurs. We supplied a loan fund, which they manage themselves. They have a committee that decides to get it. They've got criteria. The money we contributed 7 years ago, they're still revolving and paying the interest back into. We've not added anything to it. And the skills, we fund skills for them to do it. So we support that investment by funding them to learn to manage funds, to make the right decisions about the fit to their criteria, and kind of citizen engagement. And I think if we hadn't have been doing the grants work, we wouldn't have got into that position where they could manage those finances themselves and go forward. Also, equally, now that they've seen, I talk about the bursaries, they've also been lobbying their government to say, well, this is something you should support, the school side. They're not talking to them about their business side because they're asking us to work with them to make that more sustainable. We've actually taken that approach into a health fund, which we set up, which because we found people were not going to hospital with serious illnesses because they couldn't afford it. So we set up a fund, which they use the same principle we used on the entrepreneurs fund to this fund, where they have criteria, serious illness, people actually pay it back. And they as a community decide they will add to it. They've added 20% over 2 years. We have not put anything more into it, but they're going to keep that fund going because they've seen the value. So what we did was to create the opportunity to see the value of it so that they collectively are finding different ways to contribute to that. So for me, the idea of impact investment runs a number of different steps. In my ethical trading world, trade, if you want to change trade, there's costs that are currently not sustainable in the trading chain because that's why it is the way it is. So you have to initially fund that change, but also enable trade and income to actually work within the change you've made, which is why things like fair trade, organic, and so on work. Notionally, according to some economists, I would say, it shouldn't work. But it worked because we funded the idea of making people aware, developing people to reach the market requirements, all of those things, which wouldn't have come out of them just selling the product. So there are different, it's just generalized, this impact investment stuff. But I think the principle of blended finance, getting people to be able to manage things themselves, getting things to actually be more sustainable without relying on external funds all the time, getting habits changed and systems changed, that to me is what the idea of impact investment is about. But the way many people talk about it, I struggle with, because it becomes a simple, shall we give people a loan and they pay it back and we'll make money, and then we wonder why it didn't work because the foundations are not there, you know.
No, I think that's right. And I mean, I'm actually interested in this whole thing, because essentially we've been talking a bit about, the coming together, that blending, that sense of it being a mixed economy, much more than a donor, and that's what you were talking about, Danny, that not just a donor-donee kind of relationship, which is fraught with power dynamics problems or issues, but much more of a different kind of relationship and interaction. And I was wondering, Fran, does Indigo do impact investing, or is that something you've worked on, and how that operates in terms of data sharing and transparency?
We don't do impact investing directly, although we've done quite a lot to diversify the endowment investments. There's sort of interesting legal cases going on at the moment with the Charity Commission that I could happily talk about for hours. But we've tried to take an investment approach to many of the traditional grants that we've made, which is looking at helping the sustainability of organisations, but also to seeing where they are in the funding ecosystem. So I certainly wouldn't want to copy everything from the investment world, but we have a clear sense of what stage an organisation is at. Is it a new startup charity maybe trying to do a proof of concept, it doesn't have a track record or an evidence base, and it needs angel investing to get it up and running and test the idea? Or is it a well-established big organization that is maybe trying to deepen its work or to replicate somewhere else, but can attract major investment from kind of blue chip organizations? And we never really use that language traditionally in philanthropy. So I'm always looking at where's the leverage I can bring as a funder. Is it helping get more funds out of a larger foundation? Is it helping a charity to prove their impact by funding research or introducing them to other donors? And who can we then pass them on to and build relationships with other foundations and funders? So having that sense of the ecosystem and where we sit in it is really crucial to me.
And do you think NPC plays into that, challenging funders to kind of think differently? Because the one thing I've certainly known is, as a funder, that happens is that you get completely in your own little logic chain. You know, it just makes absolute sense. Someone said in a very stinging comment recently, I was in a meeting and we were talking about the pandemic, and it was saying, you know, it's amazing how, you know, essentially you have perception bias. Everything you saw during the pandemic confirmed all of your, you know, the worst cases that you thought, you know, it's appalling, you know, fill in the blank. And I think that was very true, actually. But I mean, do you think NPC challenges enough?
I think NPC does challenge, but because I'm a kind of argumentative, provocative type, I'm always keen to see more challenge. And I don't think most funders have a problem that too many people are telling truth to power. I think we can have more of that. And I encourage donors to kind of step out of their bubble and hear more. I think for me, what NPC has done a great job of is bringing funders to a new set of ideas, whether it's about theory of change or systems change or data, in a very welcoming way, which is, you know, come and learn about this, come and hear from the charities, but then deepens that dialogue and says, okay, let's really dive into this. Have you considered how this could play a part in your work? If you want to, this is how you can do more. And critically, as we've said, creating those dialogues, whether it's between charities and funders or actually between philanthropic peers. And I certainly like to get in there and stir things up. Whether it's questioning power dynamics and when funders need to take ourselves out of the conversation, or what are the tools that help challenge those power dynamics. Actually, I believe if we're all much more transparent, it breaks down some of the normal barriers. And that was very controversial a few years ago. It's become much more mainstream. And so I love the fact that NPC is playing a role there in starting those conversations and moving them on.
I think it's become more mainstream because you've kind of had a really kind of directing hand in that. Because to be honest, it's one of those things it's very hard to argue against. When someone says, you know, surely as a socially focused organization, you should be transparent. It's very hard to say no to that when it's put, but it hadn't been. So I think 360 Giving really pushed that, and NPC as well. Actually, we've got there's a question that's coming through. Do you start adding questions to the questions and answers? But what someone was asking, you know, should trustees and should Charity Commission encourage trustees to review the impact of funders, or, you know, as funders ourselves, should we essentially be prepared to lay ourselves down if we feel that A, we're not being particularly effective perhaps in achieving our mission, or we have achieved it, which, to be honest, we tend to fit such open-ended and gigantic missions as to, you know, solving poverty and that kind of thing. It's quite tricky to say we ever achieved it. But I mean, do you think there's a role for us being much stricter down with ourselves as funders in the way we might be to a charity, to say, well, you know, haven't you?
No, it's a good point, Danielle. I mean, we advocate, and we're often alone in this, and we actually think the Charity Commission, in terms of its general regulation, should probably collect more data and demand more of charities, taking account of size and so forth, so it'll be proportionate. But, you know, we would like much more charities having to report in a more substantial way on what their impact has been over the last year and what they're going to do the following year to improve it. You know, and if nothing else, that means that the board, at least at one meeting, would have to talk about their impact. And I'm sure, you know, a lot of us and a lot of people listening to this today are trustees of charities. I am of several. And you very rarely get round to talking about that. You talk about finance and, you know, safeguarding or HR issues and all the rest of it. And the key point, which is, are we using our resources in the correct way over the last year to create impact on how we're going to do it even better next year? Doesn't get discussed. So we push that quite strongly. But I think it's a really interesting point you make, Danielle. What about charitable foundations? Shouldn't they be having to report in some way like that as well? And, you know, things have got better. I mean, one of the things I think that NPC has achieved, and you might say it's a sort of, it hasn't achieved as much as we hoped, is a lot of organizations will put out an impact report now, including some foundations. It's a bit better than putting out nothing. It often doesn't really tell you that much. It will have a few examples of what people have done and tell you how many organizations they helped and give you a few case studies. And as I say, at least it's getting people into that frame of mind. But I think it would be good. And I think, you know, I can't think off the top of my head of some good exemplars, but it's one of the ways I feel to push the foundation philanthropy world is pushing the really best players and asking everybody else, if they can do it, why can't you? And in a sense, that's what 360 Giving, Fran's done a terrific job with that. But I remember, Fran, talking to you at the beginning of that, and you weren't at all sure how the sector would respond to it. A few were up for it right at the beginning. Others said, oh, no, you know, we don't want our data available. Charities will look at it and they'll work out how to appeal to us more and all the rest of it. But in the end, peer pressure worked. It's got a hell of a long way and it's terrific. So we should use that kind of pressure elsewhere in the sector.
I always dread the kind of reports and culture that would be created by something like that being managed by somebody like the Charity Commission. And where does innovation sit within that? Some of the crazy philanthropists that helped things that otherwise would never have happened happen. However, there is a point at which knowing you're having the impact, even if the impact is some people didn't die this year, you know, it may not be, you know, but how do you report that to somebody like the Charity Commission? Do you know what I mean? So, but I think that creating a culture where we do report what the impact, as well as the failings are, because some of the best work we've done is where we failed in doing what we set out to do. But the real challenge of becoming then disreputable because you didn't quite do what you said you were going to do, but you do something even more extraordinary. That's the dynamic, the tension I see in that. But I think creating a culture, and that's a role for people like NPC actually, and the sector to help create a culture where we do look at that really hard and in a kind of innovative or crazy way, if we wish, do you know what I mean? But not a very prescriptive way, otherwise that again just takes us down other silos.
I think one of the things I'm interested in is something that's come through an initiative I'm involved in at the moment, which is called the Foundation Practice Rating. And one of the things we looked at, which was looking at foundations and assessing foundations on their practices in diversity, accountability, and transparency. And one of the accountability questions we asked or looked at is, does the foundation disclose information about impact? Its own impact. And actually what foundations tend to do is disclose the impact of those we fund, but we don't talk about our own impact very often. Sometimes we do, but as a sector, it's a very small proportion of people actually talk about who've assessed and looked at our impact as a funder. And we hide behind your impact. You know, we sort of say, look, we're a funder of medical research, or we're a funder of animals, you know, donkeys, and lots of donkeys have been saved. Actually, but was that done because of us or in spite of us? It's not clear. And I think actually a little bit more precision, and Fran, you probably have more insights on that, about, you know, foundations looking at their own impact in a much more in-depth and sensible way.
I think my worry is whenever foundations decide that something needs to be done, they will come up with 100 separate ways of doing it, which normally adds to the administrative burden on charities, where we start to say, I'm very keen on proving my impact. Please, can you demonstrate for me how our funding has helped you in this bespoke survey that we'd like you to fill in, which will take 5 hours and is a PDF that you have to print off. So that's my worry. It's much more what will actually help charities to do their job or to do it better. And I'm not sure that most of them would start with, we'd like more impact reports from foundations. What I love about the foundation practice rating is that it scrutinized foundations without asking permission or even forgiveness. It just said, you're in the public domain, we're going to look at what information is available. And we need far more of that scrutiny. And I'm not just saying that because we got quite a good rating at Indigo, but actually we also got room for improvement. And that was fantastic for me because I took that back to discuss with staff and go, this is where we can do better. Let's do better. So let's talk about impact where it's going to make a meaningful difference to either the way that we do things or what's possible for charities. Otherwise, there's a risk it becomes a glossy report and we spend lots of money printing it out and leaving it in our foyer. I'd like to see, just as we've standardized some of the way we collect grants data, how would charities like us to measure impact? And how can we do that in a way which doesn't mean they have to employ 3 full-time people just to fill in surveys for us? And that's why I think listening to the voices from charities informs philanthropy a great deal.
I think that's just really powerful. And I think, Dan, that really resonates with NPC's approach, doesn't it?
I'll mute myself. No, absolutely. I mean, and there's nothing that upsets us more than charities who are asked to fill in lots of data, which we then know because we get inside, foundations they don't use. It's just reporting for the sake of reporting, helping a grant officer watch their back, quite frankly. And that is just helpless. And one of the things again which we see a lot of charities, charities try and piece their funding together. They may get funding from 4 or 5 different foundations, and they're often asked for different data from each one on a different time scale. It's completely mad. When we say to them, this is completely mad, did you go to them, all the funders, and say, can't you agree on something that, so there's only one set? They are very reluctant to. They don't want to do anything that upsets the funders. And so you get this slightly strange, well, when we say that to funders, they say, well, why don't they ask us? Well, they are very, very nervous if they've got the money. They don't want to upset people. So you get all these systems which end up getting people doing work which is not needed or is not used. So I think, absolutely right. As we bring some of these things in, we have to think, how's it going to work in practice? Is it really going to change behaviours? As I say, for me, and Albert said this a few times, it's very much about culture. And in many ways, that is what I see NPC really trying to do. It's trying to change the standard for what is acceptable, what is good behaviour, what boards should be thinking about, what is a sort of a decent evaluation or something. Doesn't mean everyone has to do exactly the same, and there's so many different organisations doing so many different things in our sector that it'd be crazy to say that. But that's in the end what it's all about. But there is a terrible danger, as government finds. I mean, I worked in the last Labour government, and we started off with some very good, public service agreements, which were very, very sensible. But they cascaded down to the front line, such that a lot of public sector employees spent all their time filling in forms so that we could have enough data on the KPIs. It was absolutely madness. And we don't want that to happen in the social sector, but I think quite a lot of that does happen, I'm afraid. I mean, just one thing as well, just that Albert really sort of piqued my thoughts when he said the last thing we want is the Charity Commission doing some of this, God help us. And we have proposed a kind of body which would be sort of owned by the sector, which would do some of this kind of thing. So rather than a regulator doing it, because regulator, it conflicts. Regulator's got to regulate and be quite a tough regulator and all the rest of it. That we need that in the sector. So bad players, bad apples are caught out, and it gives confidence to the punter that a charity that's registered, has got a certain degree of, you can have some confidence in them. But in terms of the improvement and spreading best practice and peer review and analysing the data, we need something separate. And we had proposed something like that, so didn't get 3 rounds of applause from the sector, but I think it's still an idea that's time will come.
Well, there's an opportunity to be even more unpopular from a question here, which is, should NPC start calling out bad funding practice when you see it? And would the new model that you're developing, your new funding model, kind of obviate and make that more difficult to say, actually, you know what, this is really not very good. Which is just to say, the foundation practice rating is one of those things where we just sort of say, doesn't look good to us, you don't have a website. That's kind of rubbish as a funder, not having a website at all, to tell people even what you do, not necessarily accept applications, doesn't feel like a great thing. There may be a conversation that needs to be had, but it doesn't look great. Do you think NPC can do that?
Well, I think the work which came out, which you've, one of the main funders, I mean, it is great and so forth. I mean, I have a few issues about the weightings and giving everything the same weighting, and I've debated that with Caroline a little bit. But no, it's terrific, really. I mean, we have a general point about whether we should call out bad funding practice publicly, which I think we are more comfortable with, and we do that sometimes, although we usually want to tell the board rather than just go public. We have another issue, I actually think, has bedeviled NPC from the beginning, which is how much should we publicly call out a bad charity? Because if we were to do that, that has strong implications for a charity in terms of its funding and so forth. And so we don't tend to do that. We do try and feed that back to the board, the trustees, the senior management, if we find things going wrong. But that's something we debated at times, if we see extremely waste of resources, if you like, and a charity that doesn't know what on earth it's doing, should we be telling the world more about that? Something that we still debate, but on the whole, we think it's just too big a sort of fist, as it were, for us to say that. So we try and influence sort of inside the tent, rather than going outside. But it's a live issue for us always.
Particularly tricky. I mean, can we just shifting a little bit our focus toward looking at and thinking about innovation, because the thing that NPC was 20 years ago, and I think probably you hope to continue today, is an innovator. And we've touched on innovation, in terms of blended finance, as Albert was talking about, and very much in terms of transparency, as Fran was talking about, in terms of 360 giving. I mean, how is NPC innovating now? It was an innovation to start with. How is it continuing that legacy? Dan, sorry, it's you.
To start with, I mean, in lots of ways. I mean, in a sense, we can, the sector as a whole finds it difficult to put capacity into innovation often. Charities don't have a lot of spare cash and spare reserves, and a limit to some of the risks they can take. We don't tend to have, like in the private sector, kind of new entrants that bowl through. I mean, if you look at the sort of top 100 charities compared to now and 20 years ago, it hasn't changed as much as the FT index and all sorts of issues like that. So we try and push things. So at the moment, there's a lot of work in philanthropy, which is innovative. I think about open philanthropy program, which we've got going at the moment. We're doing quite a lot about how we're not trying to invent new sort of digital products, but how digital resources can help charities help vulnerable people better, linking up data for them, helping them navigate their way through systems and so forth. And I think that's quite important. We've got a project at the minute called My Best Life, which is doing all that. We're pushing out a lot more data. Fran mentioned the Justice Data Lab. We're working quite closely with DWP to try and get an employment data lab going, and so on. And those are attempts to make it easy for charities to work out their impact using government administrative data, essentially, and constructing sort of control groups in different ways. So there's a lot of things like that we sort of keep pushing forward, and the work, again, I think that Fran and Albert have referred to about system change, which I think is very important, and trying to help philanthropists and funders understand, charities understand exactly what are the systems that are churning out the bad lives that we don't want, and how can we and where can we try and intervene and fund bits of work which will make the system work differently. And that's difficult work. It's quite innovative. Some philanthropists find it a bit difficult because it's quite far away from the sort of end, you're going upstream, you're trying to change the whole system. It's a bit hard to work out your contribution, let alone attribution for those things. But I think all those are changes in the way the system works. So we want to keep pushing these things out. They're not, some of them are, are difficult, some of them won't go anywhere, some of them are challenging funders and charities in ways that they don't like, and they just like doing the thing they've always done. They're quite comfortable doing it and so forth. And I think we've also learned, it's certainly my time at NPC, that particularly with funders actually, Danielle, that we would like them all to be innovative, taking risks, doing system change, and we encourage that. If they don't want to be like that, if they just want to be a responsive mode funder, there's still ways you can be as very good at that and not very good at that. So to some extent, we have to meet people a bit where they are, even if we're trying to move them up the sort of the levels as we go. So those are some kind of thoughts, but Albert and Fran may well have thoughts as well.
Albert, just thinking about, you're new to NPC. If you thought this would be like an amazing innovation that someone needs to do, even if it's not NPC, just like, what is the kind of bit of the plumbing, if we're using that metaphor, that could be innovated and changed to really work better for NGOs, charities, and social enterprises? Then I'll ask you after that, Fran.
So you see, I'm relatively new, so I often have to often get overexcited by what I see as the toys to play with, if you like. So I need to be careful about that. But two things, and Dan mentioned a couple of them. Two things is talking to the team about collaboration and using the convening power to bring resources, approaches, and things like that together and work on an issue, a bit like the open philanthropy approach, which is being looked at in terms of small groups. I'm quite fascinated by that, quite very interested on building on what's been done before and the skills that NPC has and bringing different skill sets to move that forward. And I think there lies innovation sometimes, and particularly around the things like the NPC labs and as I said, open philanthropy. The other element for me, we were just talking about impact investment and blended finance. And I know the team have said the capacity is challenging, but something like the My Best Life, how do NPC or the sector monetize that in the future? Is a question I've posed to the team, because I think it's fantastic work that they've done. But it shouldn't be one of those things that is just there for doing. And I know there's a tension between open source but there's a thought about that. And the team are generously working with me to connect them with people who think about these things. And I'm hoping between them, they're all smart people. They can come up with some ways to move things like that forward, either for the sector or in terms of NPC leadership. And things like that, I think there are the structural and systemic things which philanthropists can really be a tipping point for, and NPC can be a key part of that. And then there's currently what's happening in society and what we need to, new ways we need to begin to think. And some of that is beginning to happen, like what is the role of the sector in the leveling up agenda, for example. So those kind of things I'm quite heartened by. And also we're talking a lot about how does the consultancy work and the work with charities, what's that showing us about what the sector needs to think about and innovate. And it's all those things. So learning for me, is quite a key way for improving the impact of the sector and organizations. What have we learned, and how do we either go away from that and go in a different direction, or how do we make that more impactful? And I think that's something NPC for sure has a role in being that bridge. For my misspent youth, I got involved in theatre as therapy, basically. And one of the things that to this day I use in management training is an exercise called bus stop living room exercise. So you have two people, you send them into a room and you tell one of them it's their living room. You tell the other one it's a bus stop, and they have to interact. And when they get to that room, one of two things usually happens. It's either hugely comedic or it's conflictual. And the thing about that exercise is often we think we're in the same room with people and we're actually in different rooms. So one of the key things is understanding which room we're in together. And I think NPC as a bridge has a key role for that, which is that thing about making sure the players do know what the situation is, what the challenges are, what the opportunities are, and what the learning has been. And I think that's a critical role, because often we think we're working on the same thing, whether we're funders or charities, but actually we're in slightly different spaces, and so we wonder why the impact is not being had. So that's really where I see as well as a source of innovation.
That's fantastic. First of all, I'm just like imagining the bus stop living room situation. I just want to do that like now.
It's even more real when you see people actually do it. So describing it doesn't do it justice.
It's just a fantastic set of images. But just seriously, but innovation round, the learning, but also making that making some of the learning opportunities sustainable through having income streams and commodify, that those are two major challenges around innovation. How do you innovate around learning and sharing that learning, but also, how does that become sustainable in terms of actually having a resource underpinning it? And Fran, what do you think about innovation in terms of NPC, and what is the gap that needs to be filled that maybe NPC could fill?
I think there's a sort of myth in the sector that you can be an innovative funder or an impact-based funder, and similarly as a charity. And of course, we know this is nonsense, because everything that's proven to be impactful now was once innovative and unproven. And I think what I love about NPC is working out where on the journey different interventions or organisations are. If this is really early stage and it is innovative, which I think something like My Best Life is an extraordinary example of that. Okay, how are we going to measure it, check that it's as good as we think it is, and then share that learning with other people and make sure that we can really lock in the impact and grow it. Whereas sometimes we're going to be looking at a project that's saying, we know, we've done everything, this has great impact, but not enough people know about it, we need to scale and replicate. Or it's just challenging people's understanding of which model that they're in. A lot of people might describe themselves as very innovative when they're having zero impact at all. And we have to cut through a little bit of that to find out what's really going on. But I love looking at the tools, and I think the way NPC develops tools in partnership with charities and funders is really exciting. So I know NPC's got work going on at the moment about user involvement toolkits. So innovative, everyone is starting finally to talk about user involvement and how crucial it is for the design of projects. But funders are often going, we know this is a good thing, we've no idea how to do it or how to fund it. It's often not clear what the perfect result of a user involvement project should be. So anyone who's interested in feeding into this work should get in touch, because I think that's going to be a really, really powerful way that NPC can support an innovative idea and make it practical for the sector.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, just again, coming out, it's a slightly more even helicopter view, looking to the future. So this is, obviously innovation is an aspect of that, but in terms of what are the challenges to the sector as a whole, and what do you think how it might relate to NPC's mission? Albert, I mean, just looking at it, obviously you've worked in so many different aspects of the sector, and now theatre is like another one I didn't know about. What are the greatest challenges and the greatest issue facing the sector, and how it might relate to what you know of NPC's work?
I think at the moment, one of the things about society is going through a kind of a change at the moment globally, including here. And there are a number of things that are central to that. My most apocalyptic, I'll say our own impending doom is making us think in different ways. So there are the environmental challenges we face. I can remember growing up at the time when we thought we might get bombed anytime. Mm-hmm. Young people growing up these days are growing up thinking there won't be a planet for them to be on. And that's kind of a challenging thing. And the growth of inequalities, you see the Black Lives Movement. And what's heartened me really strongly, things like the Black Lives Matter movement, things like the environmental movement, young people are key players in that, and they're not playing by the rules some of us are familiar with. Going to COP26, their analysis is sharp. Their enough is enough is sharp. And we really need to get this thing of engaging with that energy in how we go forward as a sector. because there was a time when we were all complaining about not enough young people want to get involved, and or you don't have young people involved with you. But young people are coming out, but they're not doing it in the way we are accustomed to. So there's a challenge for how we harness that energy to make real systemic change and to save the planet. And I don't mean that just in environmental terms, in terms of our societies. I was unfortunate in that it happens. I was involved in going back to my old patch in North Kensington when Grenfell happened. And one of my old colleagues asked me a very, very, very startling question to me. When you were working here and this had happened, what would you have done? And it made me scan the horizon, and I thought, back then, I had a law center to call on. I had an housing action center to come. We had a legal aid where communities can take action, because we all knew years before that, those buildings were unsafe. The community had complained about them. We had no resource or access to change it. And so I looked at that situation, and at that time, what I would have done, there were youth clubs and community centers that I've gone and found out how we can respond, and we could have organized together. It would have been a together effort. We would have tried to mobilize. All of those have dissipated. I followed some of the young people to try and talk to them. They disappeared into the estate. Nobody has access to them. So we've lost a lot of community cohesion, and resources are scarce. But the sector now has a critical role to play in actually rebuilding community cohesion a bit. I think that the funding environment is going to be very, very different. Philanthropists have a key role to play as a tipping point and the leverage. I think Fran talked a lot about leveraging and making a difference. How do we organize that? We're disorganized now. I mean, that old phrase, there's no such thing as community, came dangerously close to being real. And so, and I can see that retrenching now because of various things that happen. And I think the sector has a critical role to play because it's there, it's present. And how that happens, how we measure that, how we organize to do that, how we collaborate. I think collaboration, which is why it's really interesting, the open philanthropy stuff. Collaboration and working with different parties. In my own working life, getting private sector and ethical companies to think about how they actually engage with development from the people they source from, people they might feel very distant from, but that is connected. It's quite important. If farmers stop growing cocoa because it's not valuable anymore, we'll have no chocolate. You know, but that interrelation is very, very important globally now. The world is too small. So it's what's our role in it, in the sector here? What's our connectedness to actually deal with some of these issues? Because the resources, we're not going to have the scope of resources we have had. So how do we make that work? Those are the challenges I see. And I mean, and there's steps, of course. I mean, I know I make it look apocalyptic, but there's steps to doing that. And we have some of the tools, and that's where thinkers like the NPC and philanthropists can really, really help to move forward and innovate and actually reorganize, regroup.
Mm-hmm. And Fran, just from your perspective, where would you see the challenges? Do you think those, as Albert's highlighted, are those as that connectedness question, that engagement question, and the lack of infrastructure? I mean, other things, or are those the kind of main ones?
There are two, in addition to what Albert said, that are at top of my mind, but they're quite related. One thing we haven't mentioned that much today is the role of government. And I think there's a huge debate to be had. Certainly, most people in charities have quite strong views on how well government is supporting them. And that's true at any time in history. But what's the role as an independent organisation in us challenging government, informing it, advising it, bringing people together for that debate? And I think that's something NPC's always had a really strong role in, bringing voices together to feed into government. And then also holding it to account as well, and looking at data on funding that was delivered during the early stages of COVID, for example, or through some of the sector bodies like National Lottery. But the other thing that's on my mind is maybe a bit theoretical, but it's the debate about really, is philanthropy and charity a good thing or a bad thing? And actually, I'm really thrilled that that conversation is happening. It's happening far too late. We should have been talking about this decades ago. And philanthropy was for a long time, very unquestioned. And it still seems slightly radical to go, maybe not everything philanthropists do is perfect and wonderful. So we need to have far more of that. But I'm hoping that it doesn't slip into philanthropy is therefore all a bad thing and should end. So the debate's been happening, it's transatlantic, it's often quite polarized. I recommend everyone read Beth Breeze's fantastic new book, In Defense of Philanthropy. There's a lot of more nuanced thinking out there, but it needs to be a dialogue. And so I think NPC sits right at the heart of that debate in going, yes, there is value, but there could be so much more. How can we make it better? How can we call out bad practice and bring in the different voices to challenge that?
That's brilliant. That's a fantastic set of issues. And I absolutely can agree with the Beth Breeze book. It's really fascinating and really great. Looks at philanthropy and critiques of philanthropy from lots of different perspectives. But Dan, I wanted to pose, before I kind of ask the final kind of question to everyone, in terms of, you know, your pithy final thing that you would want to see from NPC over the next 5 years. Someone, well, actually, Richard Harris has asked Dan, what is the worst bit of advice you were given, perhaps when you joined NPC, from friends in terms of how best to make an impact and move the dial?
That's an interesting question, Danielle. One of the lovely things about working in, but a weird thing in civil society, when I got the job at NPC, you know, a lot of friends who didn't know anything about it, but I said it was about charities and philanthropy, and they said, well, that sounds a good thing. I remember some years before when I got a job running what's now called New Local, it's called New Local Government Network there, which is about local authorities, and people say, oh no, you're going to work on local government issues, you know. So you get a kind of warm glow thing working with charities and so forth. I mean, so, you know, I don't think, I mean, you know, the thing that NPC is entirely about good people, and the key thing is hiring good people and giving them their head, letting them do good things. I did have some people who said, you know, you should manage it in a different way, but I hope the way I've done it, you know, allows us to attract good people to some extent. And the board sometimes ask me about this. They say, oh, you said you were going to work on all this, but you seem to be working on all that now and not on this. And partly it's because the world changes quite fast and you have to move with it. And partly if I have people who are passionate about an area, that's where we should do more work. So I think that the management style in a place like NPC, because it's the people, really, we're nothing else. And that's what you've always got to get right. And I do think, I mean, it's a problem. I don't know if it's come through the work that you've been talking about, Danielle, but I do think in the charity sector as a whole, and you see this in surveys, management is not brilliant. It's partly because as a sector, we kind of underinvest in HR because we don't have the money. But if you ever see surveys of employees of charities, they will score very, very highly on you want to go to work because you believe in what you're doing, much higher than the private sector or even the public sector. But if you ask, does management listen to you? You know, is the good HR, the charity sector, I'm afraid, comes way down. I don't know what it's like in the foundation sector. Interesting if there were questions on that as well. And I think it is a slight problem, and it's come through in recent years with quite a lot of upset in charities in different ways. And there's lots of reasons for that, but one of them is that we don't invest enough in that. And it's difficult. You know, you're raising money, people want it to go to the front line. The whole sector tends to underinvest in back office, in systems, in training, in research, all the rest of it, but equally in HR. So I think that is a problem.
I think that's right. I'd just say my estimation is probably the foundations it's worse. We tend to be a little bit generally behind charities because we don't have to be quite as sharp. You were talking a bit about that, the whole fundraising thing, and having systems and having someone you may be accountable to, just in a very direct way. And quite often we don't have that as clearly as others. I think we do, but I think it's just perhaps a bit hidden. So I'm just going to sort of wrap up this panel bit, hand back over to Dan, but just a couple of points from Albert and Fran, just on what's exciting you? What's exciting out there, and what's, you know, what do you want to see from NPC over the next 5 years, just to send us all off with a happy, rosy glow? Albert, what's exciting you about what's happening? I mean, we've talked a little bit about the challenges, but what's the kind of prospective element looking forward?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, I'm a relatively boring chap. That you know, the work around actually the open philanthropy stuff and the my best self, and it centers around a theme that I think is important in the points I was just making, which is actually over the next 5 years, I'd love to see groups who normally are not engaging with the NPC and others, and the NPC helping provide tools for those organizations. So if you're working on gender and the role of women in society, and particularly trying to change the way the pay structure works or the violence against women, the NPC's work is going to really arm you to influence and change and do your work better. It's going to enhance what you do, and therefore you have a reason to engage with them. If you're a Black group working on racial justice, that you feel that you're being armed with good information, the kind of information, let's be honest, working class organizations, Black organizations, the kind of intelligence they don't have access to, that NPC has access to. I'd love to see that being much more widely available and used. That would, for me, be amazing. And you know, I think where I would like to see NPC in 5 years is not so much where it was back in the day, but more thinking about we're armed with philanthropists, we're armed with charities, we've got the intellectual capacity and time. I remember going to a university and telling students, and you can imagine the looks I got, you're very lucky you have time to think. And because once you start working like some of us, time to think goes. And I think that's probably the challenge the sector faces. So if NPC is doing thinking, how does that thinking get into the arms of people who really need it to make serious change? And if that is happening over the next 5 years, I'll be a very happy man.
Well, it sounds like it's going to, because you're there to make sure it does. That's excellent. And Fran, your thoughts?
I think I'm looking at the sort of the near future, and I'm actually encouraged by some of the ways that funding practice changed during the early part of the pandemic. By no means all funders, but a good number changed. They acted more quickly than sometimes our normal glacial pace can be, and said, we need to help charities now, and that can't wait for a 3-year strategic review or our normal 6-month applications. We need to get money out of the door, and it needs to be much more unrestricted and trusting relationships with the charities. And it turns out, hey, we can do that. Actually, we always could, we just didn't very often. So there's a huge movement towards trust-based grant making, unrestricted core funding. And I think that's been actually pointed to in a question from Grant Gordon. Why aren't we doing that all the time? And so can we take some of the progress that was possible in this crisis situation and make it the new normal, and say, if we can do it then, why can't we always do it? But at the same time, to have the debate which says, this is brilliant, how do you measure it? If everything is trust-based, is relationship-based, can we still tell if it's working? Because not everything does. And as funders, we hate admitting that sometimes we can make things worse, or we can actually do harm. Not just that it doesn't work, but we've made something worse. So if we're doing trust-based grant making, are we still interrogating ourselves and being able to listen to what reality is telling us about whether we're helping or hurting? So I want to see those dynamics played out. And again, I think NPC is right at the heart of those debates.
That is such an excellent challenge. I think you definitely take that away, and really be a central part of how we think about what we're doing as funders. I'm going to hand back to you, Dan. to wrap us up and to say any final words, particularly, you know, around NPC going forward. But thank you all for the opportunity to kind of have a chat with you. It's been absolutely excellent and really helpful. My thinking, I'm buzzing going away. So I hope that it's been interesting for the audience. And I'm sorry we haven't got to all of the questions and points. They were really great. And thank you ever so much for contributing them. And I'm sure the team will pick anything up that is anything that can be directly answered. But thanks again. Cheers.
Thank you, Danielle. Fantastic, fantastic sharing, fantastic getting your insights, and thanks, Fran and Albert. I think, you know, we're a slightly strange organisation, which people sometimes find a bit difficult to pin down. But in a sense, because we're trying to help the whole sector raise its game, and we get more social good, if you like, from the resources that we have as a sector. We've always believed as well that if we can show that to the world, we will get more resources coming into us. And so it's you know, although we're mainly about the sort of like the impact, we think that will create the volume as well. And, you know, and that's why, in a sense, it's why we're launching our fundraising appeal for our 20th year this year, because we need that funding, I think, in the next 20 to allow us to keep doing that and reaching out. And some of the things that Albert's talked about, which we think a lot about, is how do we get to some of the smaller charities, community groups and so forth, which could do with some of the knowledge, tools and all the rest of it we've got, but do find that hard to access for capacity and totally understandable reasons. And that's a big question as well. I would say, I mean, it seems to me, you know, we're passionate MPC, I'm passionate about the sector. It's going to be very important. I mean, I'm an economist, so I was watching very strongly yesterday the spring statement, and we are in for a pretty terrible time, quite frankly, in the UK. And the social sector will be pulled to try and help a lot of very vulnerable people who are going to have a very, very tough time. So the social sector is crucial there. It's crucial in terms of its voice and civil society in communities, as Albert said, but also, you know, as a kind of pluralist society. And, you know, we have got quite involved in some of the groups who are worried about what looks to be, whether intentional or not, a bit of a clamp down on civic voice that's happening through various bits of legislation, whether intended or not. Because we feel that one of the ways that charities have impact is because they do advocate for the people they care about. They understand that there's people in an area, particular groups, who are having a bad time, and they advocate to government at national level, at local level, directly elected mayors, and that's a crucial thing. So that's why we've got ourselves involved in that. And there is a worry in the UK, but in other countries too, that civil society is being undervalued, it's being silenced, and that is not good for a healthy democracy, healthy society, and ultimately a healthy economy actually as well. So it's a really important time, I think, for us all to think hard about how we support this sector. Our bit of it is, I say, is an independent bunch of people, very analytical, prepared to talk, say what we think, we're not restrained in any way. And I think that's important. We work with lots of other groups within the sector, within the UK and elsewhere, who are, if you like, representative groups, and it's important we all work together. So I hope everyone's enjoyed this event. I hope you'll keep in touch with what we're doing at NPC. Those of you who can manage it, do have a look at our appeal and see if you can support that. But we look forward to working with you all, certainly over the next decade and hopefully over the next 2 decades. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Danielle.